So we've all looked in the mirror and wondered, haven't we? What's the real recipe for who we are? Is it the ingredients we inherit, our genes? Or is it more the environment we're sort of cooked in?
It's that fundamental question, nature versus nurture. And today, that's exactly what we're digging into.
Yeah, this deep dive is all about how our genes and our experiences really work together to sculpt us, especially when we look at psychology.
Exactly. And for this exploration, we've pulled together, well, quite a range of sources. We're looking at core psychology concepts, naturally.
Okay.
Plus, diving into intelligence with crash course psychology, which is always fun. Yeah. Then, there's how genes and environment mix in mental health using CMH resources.
CMH, right.
Looking back at Mendel's genetics via TED-Ed, the foundational stuff, and tackling the whole nature-nurture question directly with the NOBA module.
And the twin studies, too, I see.
Oh, absolutely crucial. We've got material from Khan Academy and TEDx talks on twin and adoption studies. Plus, we'll analyze the big one, the Minnesota study of twins reared apart. Really fascinating stuff there.
Okay, so our mission today, it's really about unraveling this partnership between what we're born with and what we live through.
Precisely. We want to understand how they collaborate, how they shape everything from our personalities to how we solve problems, even our vulnerabilities.
And hopefully give you listening some real insights into, well, your own story maybe, and the bigger human picture.
That's the goal.
Okay, let's get into it. Maybe a good place to start is just defining what are psychological disorders. Feels foundational.
Absolutely. Before we talk cause, we need the what.
Yeah.
So generally we're talking about patterns of thoughts, feelings, behaviors that are, well, abnormal.
Abnormal meaning?
Meaning they cause significant distress or impairment in life. They usually reflect some kind of dysfunction, biological, psychological, maybe developmental. And crucially, they're not just culturally expected reactions to something specific. Like grief isn't a disorder, right?
Got it. And that's where the DSM-5 comes in. I hear that term a lot.
Exactly. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition now. It's the main classification system used in the U.S.
Right.
Provides detailed criteria for, I think it's 237 specific disorders currently listed. Symptoms, prevalence, risk factors, comorbidities. What else tends to go along with it?
237. Wow. That sounds incredibly detailed, maybe even controversial.
Oh, it has its critics, for sure.
Yeah.
But for clinicians and researchers, those detailed criteria are pretty invaluable for diagnosis and for studying these conditions.
So how did people think about this stuff historically, before all the biology and psychology focus?
Well, for a huge chunk of history, the dominant view is supernatural.
Like demons and spirits.
Yeah, or divine punishment, possession, that kind of thing. And look, those beliefs still exist in some cultures.
Yeah.
But contemporary perspectives, they mostly focus on the biological.
Genetics, brain chemistry.
Exactly. Brain function, hormones, neurotransmitters. And then there's the psychological perspective. Stress, thought patterns, learning, environment.
But it sounds like the modern view tries to bring those together. It's not just one or the other.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
The biopsychosocial model is really the standard now. It sees disorders arising from this complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors.
Okay.
And a really key concept here is the diathesis stress model.
Diathesis stress. Explain that.
Okay, so diathesis just means a predisposition or vulnerability. Could be genetic, could be something from early life.
Right.
The model suggests you might have this underlying vulnerability, but doesn't necessarily mean you'll develop the disorder. It often takes significant stress environmental triggers to activate it.
So it's like having a loaded gun, but stress pulls the trigger.
That's a decent analogy,
Yeah.
yeah. Or like a dimmer switch set low. A surge of stress can make the light suddenly flare up. The predisposition plus the stressful event equals a higher likelihood.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk intelligence. Something everyone thinks they know, but defining it seems tricky.
Oh, it absolutely is tricky. As Crash Course points out, it's not like measuring height, right? It's not this single tangible thing. Its meaning can really shift depending on the culture, the person's age, the specific skills involved.
So what's the common ground then?
Well, a lot of definitions circle around the ability to learn from experience, solve problems effectively, and use knowledge to adapt to new situations.
So it's more about using knowledge than just having it.
Exactly. It's about application and adaptation, not just test scores.
Because we all know people who are brilliant in one area but maybe struggle elsewhere. It doesn't seem like one single smartness.
Precisely. And that's reflected in the theories. You had Spearman early on, proposing this G factor, a general intelligence underlying everything.
Like an overall IQ score.
Sort of the theoretical basis for that idea, yes.
Yeah.
But then you had Thurstone saying, hang on, it's more like 7 distinct clusters of mental abilities.
Okay, breaking it down more.
And then Howard Gardner really blew it open with his theory of multiple intelligences. He proposed 8 different kinds.
8. Like what?
Linguistic, logical, mathematical, ones we usually think of, but also musical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalist.
Wow. That covers a lot more ground.
It does. And then you have Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory, focusing on 3 types: analytical, creative, and practical intelligence.
Analytical, creative, practical. Okay, tell me more about creative intelligence. That feels less testable.
It is harder to pin down, for sure. Creativity is about producing novel and valuable ideas. Standard tests often look for one right answer, which isn't really how creativity works. But Sternberg and his colleagues suggested 5 key components.
Okay, what are they?
Expertise. You need a solid knowledge base, imaginative thinking skills, seeing things differently, making connections, a venturesome personality.
Willing to take risks.
Exactly. Tolerating ambiguity, persevering. Then, intrinsic motivation, doing it for the love of it, not just rewards. And finally, a creative environment support, encouragement.
That's a great framework. And didn't they use Sherlock Holmes as an example?
They did. He's got the expertise, right? Deep knowledge. He has those imaginative leaps, seeing clues others miss.
Definitely venturesome, goes to great lengths.
Highly intrinsically motivated, loves the puzzle itself. And arguably, Watson and his Baker Street setup provide a supportive, if sometimes exasperated, environment.
Huh. Yeah, I can see that. It pulls it all together.
It does. And then, separate but related, is emotional intelligence.
Right, EQ.
Yeah, defined by Salavi and Mayer as perceiving, understanding, managing, and using emotions.
So reading the room, controlling your own reactions.
And more. Understanding why emotions change, using them to guide thinking and behavior. It's that people smarts aspect, beyond just academic ability. It's crucial for life success, arguably.
Definitely feels important. Okay, now, the history of testing intelligence. It sounds like it got complicated.
Even dark. It absolutely did, unfortunately. Early attempts, especially by Francis Galton back in the 1800s, were heavily influenced by Darwin, his cousin.
Natural selection applied to intelligence.
Pretty much. Galton believed intelligence was highly heritable and was a major proponent of eugenics.
Eugenics. Selective breeding for humans.
Yes. The idea of improving the human race by encouraging reproduction among the intelligent and discouraging it among others. Deeply flawed and ethically horrifying in retrospect, but it gained traction.
And that led to misuse of the tests.
Hugely. In the early 20th century, Binet and Simon in France developed tests initially to help kids needing extra school support based on mental age. Binet himself thought intelligence could be nurtured.
Okay, that sounds reasonable.
But his work was taken up by others, like Louis Terman in the U.S., who adapted it and really pushed for widespread testing, often with a clear eugenicist agenda.
Oh, dear.
It led directly to policies like forced sterilization of tens of thousands in the U.S. deemed feeble-minded. And tragically, the Nazis embraced this, using IQ tests as part of their horrific ideology and justification for atrocities.
Wow. That's a really chilling history to remember when we talk about measuring intelligence.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
A vital cautionary tale about the potential for misuse of psychological tools.
Definitely. Okay, so let's move to the core now. This interaction between genes and environment. It's clear it's not one or the other.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
The modern view is all about gene-environment interaction, or GXE.
GXE, okay.
It means the environment's impact on a trait can differ based on your genetic makeup. And conversely, your genetic tendencies might express themselves differently depending on the environment.
So it's not nature versus nurture anymore.
Nope. That debate is largely obsolete. It's nature and nurture constantly interacting, like baking ingredients, the flour, sugar, eggs are the genes, the mixing, the oven temperature, the baking time. That's the environment. Change the cake.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But it also sounds really complex to actually study. What makes it so hard?
Well, several things. First, just defining and accurately measuring environment is tough. It's everything, right? From prenatal conditions to social interactions to diet.
Right, it's vast.
And then there is gene-environment correlation, or GE. This is where your genes might actually influence the environments you experience.
How does that work?
Well, think about personality. If you're genetically predisposed to be extroverted, you might seek out more social situations. If you're predisposed to risk-taking, you might end up in riskier environments.
So your genes are kind of steering you towards certain experiences.
Exactly, which makes it really tricky to disentangle whether an outcome is due to the environment itself or because the genes led the person to that environment in the first place.
Okay, so how do researchers try to pick this apart? Twin studies seem key.
They're fundamental. Comparing monozygotic MZ or identical twins 100% shared genes with dizygotic DZ, or fraternal twins about 50% shared genes, like regular siblings.
And they usually share the same home environment, roughly.
Right. That's the assumption. So if identical twins are significantly more similar for a trait, like, say, schizophrenia, than fraternal twins are, it points to a stronger genetic influence.
Because the environment is similar, but the genetic similarity is higher in the MZ twins.
Precisely. And then there are really powerful studies of identical twins raised apart. Same genes, different environments.
So any differences between them are likely due to...
Just environment, or at least non-inherited factors. It helps isolate the environmental impact on a shared genetic blueprint.
What about adoption studies? How do they fit in?
They offer another angle. You compare an adopted person to their biological family, shared genes, different environment, and their adoptive family, shared environment, different genes.
Okay.
If the adoptee is more like their biological relatives for a trait, that suggests genetic influence. More like the adoptive relatives, that points to environmental influence.
Makes sense. Are there downsides to adoption studies?
Yeah, some limitations. Adoptive homes might not represent the full range of environments, especially very adverse ones.
Yeah.
And adoption placement isn't always random. Agencies might try to match kids to similar families, which can complicate things.
Right, confounding factors. But despite these challenges, have these studies shown clear evidence of gene-environment interaction?
Oh, absolutely. Twin studies show that heritability itself, the proportion of variance due to genes, isn't fixed. It can change depending on the environment.
Really? How?
For example, some studies suggest the heritability of certain behavioral issues might be higher in stable environments. In more chaotic environments, the environmental factors might overwhelm the genetic predispositions, playing a larger role.
So the environment can sort of dial up or dial down the genetic influence.
In a way, yes. It affects how genetic potential gets actualized. Also, major life events like trauma or loss can clearly moderate how genetic and environmental risks for things like depression or anxiety play out.
And adoption studies, have they found GXE evidence?
Yes, particularly for conditions like alcoholism, antisocial behavior, and schizophrenia. They show that having a genetic risk combined with an adverse environment like a dysfunctional adoptive family significantly increases the odds compared to having just the genetic risk or just the adverse environment.
The Finnish adoption study on schizophrenia is often cited, isn't it?
That's a classic. It showed that individuals with a high genetic risk for schizophrenia were much more likely to develop the disorder if they were raised in adoptive families with high levels of conflict or communication problems, compared to those with the same genetic risk raised in healthier family environments.
So it's really that specific detrimental combination.
It often seems to be, yes.
Yeah.
And now we're increasingly able to incorporate specific genetic marker information.
Looking at actual named genes.
Exactly. It moves beyond just statistical inference from twin adoption data. For example, research on the serotonin transporter gene, 5-HTT. Variations in this gene seem to interact with early life stress. While studies in monkeys, for instance, show that those with a certain version of the gene were much more susceptible to developing anxiety if they experienced stressful early rearing compared to monkeys with a different version in the same environment.
Wow. Specific gene, specific environment interaction.
Right. Another example is the dopamine D2 receptor gene, DRD2. It's linked to reward pathways. Studies suggest interactions between this gene and stressful environments might influence risk for alcoholism, performance on some cognitive tasks, even personality traits like extroversion.
So certain gene variants might make us more sensitive to our surroundings, good or bad.
That seems to be the case for some genes, yes.
Yeah.
They might amplify the effects of the environment.
And you mentioned this might be especially important in neurodevelopmental disorders, like autism or schizophrenia.
That's a very strong hypothesis, yes. Because development is such a dynamic process, the interplay between genes and environment during those critical early periods is likely magnified. With autism, for instance, we know there's a strong genetic component. But identical twins aren't always 100% concordant, meaning non-shared environmental factors. Unique experiences must also play a significant role.
Could environmental factors include things like infections during pregnancy?
That's one area being researched. Animal models have explored links between maternal viral infections during pregnancy and autism-like behaviors in offspring with certain genetic susceptibilities. It's complex, though.
And schizophrenia. You mentioned the twin concordance is around 50%.
Right, even for identical twins, which strongly implies that environmental factors are critical alongside the genetic vulnerability.
What kind of environmental factors?
Things like complications during pregnancy or birth, maternal infections like the flu during pregnancy, maybe even early life stress or substance use. These factors seem to interact with the underlying genetic risk.
Is there physical evidence for this interaction?
Some studies suggest so. For example, links have been found between obstetric complications and brain structure differences like larger ventricles, specifically in individuals who also have a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia.
It's really painting a picture of genes loading the gun and environment sometimes pulling the trigger, like you said earlier.
It's a recurring theme, yes.
Yeah.
Though sometimes the environment might also provide protective factors, resilience. It's not always negative.
Right. So let's just clarify behavioral genetics and these studies a bit more. Behavioral genetics is the field studying this mix.
Yes, exactly. The science of how genes and environments combine to shape behavior and traits.
And the twin method, just to recap, compares identical twins, MZ, 100% shared genes, with fraternal twins, DZ, 50% shared genes.
Assuming they share a similar environment because they're raised together.
Right. And higher similarity or concordance in MZ twins suggests
A stronger genetic influence on that trait. Like the schizophrenia example, much higher concordance in MZ twins than DZ twins points to genes playing a big role.
But there's that small caveat that maybe MZ twins have even more similar environments.
Yes, some argue they might be treated more similarly, choose more similar activities, etc., than DZ twins. It's something researchers try to account for, but it's a potential confounder.
Okay. And adoption studies again, comparing adoptees to biological versus adoptive families.
To tease apart genetic similarity from environmental similarity, similarity to biofamily suggests genes, similarity to adoptive families suggests environment.
With the limitations we discussed, non-random placement, maybe limited range of adoptive environments.
Correct.
But the gold standard almost seems to be identical twins raised apart. That's like nature's own experiment.
It really is. Incredibly rare, but incredibly valuable. Same genes, totally different environments from infancy usually.
So if they end up similar on a trait,
It's very powerful evidence for genetic influence. Because what else could explain it?
which brings us to the Minnesota study of twins reared apart. That was a big one.
Landmark study, absolutely. Led by Thomas Bouchard. They managed to find and study over 100 pairs of MZ twins raised apart from all over the world.
Over 100 pairs. That's amazing they found so many. What did they find?
Striking similarities across a huge range of things: personality measures, interests, leisure activities, religious attitudes, vocational interests, and notably IQ.
How similar were their IQs?
Remarkably similar. The correlation between IQ scores of identical twins reared apart was almost as high as for identical twins raised together.
Wow. So the different family environments didn't seem to make much difference to their IQ scores.
According to their findings, surprisingly little. Their conclusion was quite strong. Rearing environment had minimal impact on IQ similarity for these MZ twins, suggesting a substantial genetic component to intelligence differences.
That is compelling. And didn't that study produce some almost unbelievable anecdotes?
Oh, definitely. Nancy Segal's TEDx talk highlights some amazing ones. The Jim twins are famous.
Right, Jim Lewis and Jim Springer.
Separated at birth, reunited at 39. Found out they'd both married women named Linda, divorced, remarried women named Betty. Both named their first sons James Allen, or Alan.
No way.
Both had childhood dogs named Toy. Both drove the same model and color car, smoked the same brand of cigarettes, had similar jobs, vacationed in the same spot in Florida. The list goes on. It's uncanny.
That's bizarrely specific. And there were others.
Yes. Jack and Oscar, one raised Jewish in Trinidad, the other Catholic by his Nazi grandmother in Germany. Totally different worlds.
Wow. And they were similar.
Shared weird habits. Both liked spicy food, wore rubber bands on their wrists, flushed the toilet before and after using it, read magazines back to front, dipped buttered toast in coffee. Similar temperaments, too.
It really does make you think. These tiny specific preferences seemingly linked to genes despite vastly different lives.
Exactly. There were others, too. The Colombian twins accidentally switched at birth in different families. Dorothy and Bridget, who both giggled constantly. Mark and Jerry, both firefighters. These anecdotes powerfully illustrate the potential reach of genetic influence.
It certainly pushes back against the idea that environment is everything. So, where does this leave the whole nature-nurture debate today? Is it even a debate?
Not really, no. Within psychology, that versus framework is seen as outdated, kind of simplistic.
So it's accepted that everything is a mix.
Pretty much. Virtually all complex traits, psychological or physical, result from this continuous dynamic interplay between genes and environment. Almost everything has some genetic basis, but no behavioral trait is 100% inherited.
But figuring out the exact percentage of each contribution is still hard.
Extremely hard, maybe impossible or even conceptually flawed. Even with sophisticated designs, separating them cleanly is a huge challenge.
And that heritability coefficient number we sometimes see, like IQ is X% heritable. What does that actually mean?
Okay, this is really important and often misunderstood. Heritability is a population statistic. It estimates how much of the differences we see among individuals in a specific group can be attributed to the genetic differences among those individuals.
So it's not about my IQ being X% genetic.
Absolutely not. It doesn't apply to an individual. And it's specific to the population studied and the environment they live in. If the environment changes or the genetic diversity changes, the heritability estimate can change too. It's not a fixed property of the trait itself.
Okay, that's a crucial clarification. It's about variance within a group.
Exactly. And we always have to be careful about correlation versus causation.
Right.
Just because something runs in families doesn't mean it's purely genetic. Families share environments too.
Right.
The real picture is incredibly complex.
Yep.
You have gene-environment interaction, GXE, gene-environment correlation, or GE, and then there's epigenetics.
Epigenetics, that's where the environment can change how genes are expressed.
Precisely. Environmental factors, diet, stress, toxins, can attach chemical tags to our DNA that turn genes on or off without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself.
Yeah.
It adds another layer of complexity to how nurture shapes nature's expression.
So the influence of genes might be quite subtle depending on everything else going on.
Often, yes. The impact depends heavily on the context.
Okay, this has been incredibly clarifying. So if we were to sum up the main points from this deep dive, what are the big takeaways?
I'd say first, psychological traits, disorders, abilities, they're all products of a really complex, ongoing dance between our genetic inheritance and our environmental experiences. Second, intelligence isn't one single thing. It's multifaceted, and both nature and nurture contribute significantly to its development and expression.
Right.
Third, twin and adoption studies, especially those rare cases of identical twins reared apart, provide powerful, sometimes startling evidence for the significant role genetics plays across a surprisingly wide range of human characteristics.
And fundamentally, the question isn't which one matters more anymore.
Oh, exactly. That's the old way of thinking. The real question, the modern question, is how do they work together? How does this intricate interplay unfold throughout our lives to make us uniquely who we are?
It's a much more dynamic and honestly more interesting picture. This has been fantastic. Really makes you think differently.
It's a fascinating area, constantly evolving.
So, for our final thought today, something for you to reflect on. Think about your own life for a moment. What parts of your personality, your skills, maybe even health issues you've dealt with, where might you see potential roots in your family history, your genetics? And conversely, what aspects feel much more shaped by your unique path, your upbringing, your choices, the places you've lived, the people you've known? How might understanding this constant back and forth between your nature and your nurture actually empower you, maybe help you make different choices, or just appreciate the complex journey that's made you, you?
It's a lifelong interaction.
Definitely something to ponder, a continuous dance indeed.